Well, good evening, friends in Sweden and in the UK, from different parts of the UK and Sweden and Malmo, but we may be joined by other people in the course of this talk. I am Gonzalo, representing the United Nations Association Climate and Oceans, and also the London and Southeast region here in the United Kingdom. The topic is climate change, key interactions between Earth, atmosphere, and the oceans. An introduction. My understanding is that this talk is going to be recorded, so it could be revisited, because I am going to be covering a lot of material, which I hope it's useful. Sometimes can get a bit complicated because of the topic, but we can always arrange another sort of session for questions and answers or something. Anyway, I'm going to start with the first, let me see. Okay, here we are, it's working. Now, Earth from space, and the view that we get from the Earth is obviously the blue planet. 3/4 of the planet is water. It is a sustainable planet, but with huge human impact on the sustainability of the planet. So the more we understand how Earth sustains life, or the biosphere, the more we will understand the human impact over it. So we need, in my view, a systemic approach, even from space. By the way, that is not the moon there in front of the Earth. That is a satellite picture, but it's an asteroid looking towards the Earth. But this systemic approach, even from space, because we need, as a planet, the whole solar system in order to sustain our planet and our climate for that matter. The sun, of course, binding our solar system together through its gravitational force, and its radiation is essential for our biosphere. The other planets in our solar system, we need them to stay in stable orbits for our planet to stay in a relative stable orbit, so that we have a stable climate. This is done through all the planet's gravitational forces, of course, interacting and moving, interacting together. Although we know that Earth's elliptical orbit changes and has changed during long periods of time, creating changes to our past climates, as described in what is known the Malkovich model of the Earth's orbit. And we can talk more about that in our discussion. But let's get a bit closer. And in this beautiful picture, we see obviously again the blue planet, but the moon. And the moon, we have to remember, that has influence of the climate of our blue planet. Through its gravitational force, it keeps the Earth spinning stable on its own axis, its own rotation. Any out of control wobbles or tilting on its rotation would have an impact on our climate. And it would trigger, most probably, an ice age, for example. Now, Earth's wobbles happen, but over long periods of time, thousands of years. So the moon also helps stabilizing our climate. Now, here is another interesting image of our blue planet. But we are now familiar with the issues that we face in our sustainable planet. Extreme weather changes affecting the world and ocean, sea levels rising, heat waves, floods, droughts, glaciers and polar oceans melting away, global warming and rising CO2 emissions, among other gases. Of course, in the case of the oceans, important as it is, ocean pollution, plastics, microplastics, all that. And in order to try to explain the issues, it's important to notice in this picture, please, notice the equator and the poles. That is crucial. For our climate to be habitable, and in order to sustain life, it needs to redistribute energy, particularly heat. That is crucial for understanding the sustainability of our planet. Redistribution of energy is key, particularly heat. Redistribution of heat between the equator and the tropics and the polar regions. In other words, from hot to cold. We have to remember that we don't live in a pure sphere as such, but it's slightly shattered. So the equator is closer to the sun, and it receives more heat. So that heat needs to be redistributed in order to make it habitable, the biosphere. So the polar regions, Arctic and Antarctic, are part of what is called the cryosphere. The cryosphere, that is the frozen parts of our planet. And this case, it's because we have the sea ice in those regions, Arctic Ocean and Southern Ocean, and the permanent ice caps on Greenland, Antarctica, and parts of the North Antarctica and Siberia. The cryosphere also includes Antarctica's 675 glaciers or glaciers. So all that is part of the cryosphere. These polar regions, I have to stress again, are essential for this redistribution of energy in the form of heat on the planet. And this is done between the atmosphere and the ocean, as we will see. The atmosphere and the ocean work together in this key redistribution of heat. So heat travels from the equator to the polar regions, and the thermal energy is transformed into kinetic energy, generating the winds in the lower part of the atmosphere, known as the troposphere. So heat is transformed into kinetic energy, and that is what generates the winds. We will come back to this later. But what happens to this heat? And now we come to the natural greenhouse effect. Let's talk a little bit about that. I will probably come back to that slide in a bit. But we have to remember that the heat in the atmosphere has two sources mainly. One is internal to the atmosphere, the other one is external to the atmosphere. The internal one is, of course, volcanoes. It's an internal source of heat, comes from the core of the Earth. They also spew out CO2 or carbon emissions, natural gas to the atmosphere, and other greenhouse gases like sulfur and water vapor, etc. These gases are essential to forming the natural greenhouse effect that our atmosphere needs in order to warm the surface of the planet and to allow the living conditions of the biosphere. And in this picture here, it just gives us an idea, an example of that greenhouse effect. We will talk a little bit more about that. So Earth needs to keep some of this heat and gas and redistribute them through the winds and the oceans. Now, the second source of heat, which is vitally important, and that is what is in this picture, is external and comes from the sun, of course, in the form of radiation. But again, we need to keep some of this radiation, and we are helped by Earth's natural greenhouse effect, the greenhouse layer, as it's known, and it consists of the main gases there. It's in that layers carbon dioxide, water vapor, even methane, ozone, oxygen molecules, and some sulfur that comes from the volcanoes. Now, without the natural greenhouse effect, Earth would probably be a frozen planet. So we need those basic conditions to allow the biosphere to flourish. But some of this heat needs to return to outer space and pass through the greenhouse layer. Of course, the problem we have now is that of the buildup of human enhanced gas emissions, too much CO2 emissions, too much methane, nitrogen, etc., creating this human-enhanced greenhouse effect, trapping too much of this heat, and the result is global warming, particularly measured up by CO2 rising concentrations reflected on what is known the Keeling curve since 1958, and these rising CO2 rising concentrations beyond what seems sustainable for the planet. So heat in the atmosphere, some of this heat then is absorbed by the oceans. The ocean has huge thermal capacity. Let's just think about that, huge thermal capacity in the oceans, helping us to retain, on the one hand, some of this heat coming from the sun, but also to absorb. The first 3 meters of the surface of the global ocean has the same thermal capacity of the entire atmosphere. So there is huge transfer of heat, of energy from the atmosphere to the ocean. And this is very important. It's a very important key interaction between the two, atmosphere and the oceans. Transfer of heat, transfer of energy from the atmosphere to the oceans. But this redistribution of heat between the atmosphere and the oceans gets more complex because, so it's not that straightforward, and I'll come to this next. And it gets more complex because of the Earth's rotation on its axis. Winds from the equator and tropical areas get deflected by the eastward rotation of the Earth, generating what is called the Coriolis effect. And this Coriolis effect in the northern hemisphere makes the winds get deflected eastbound to the right. In the southern hemisphere, the winds get deflected westbound. So it's a bit of a mismatch of winds from hotter regions to colder regions. But the Coriolis effect makes this a little bit more interesting, an interesting mix. There's a lot more about this. It creates the Hartley cells and the polar cells, but it's beyond the scope of this talk. Now, these complex surface winds then generate the surface ocean currents. In other words, what happens with this is that kinetic energy from the atmosphere is transferred as kinetic energy to the oceans. Again, it's transfer of energy from the atmosphere to the oceans in the form of the winds, and the winds are going to generate the surface currents. And the ocean currents will redistribute heat around the planet as well. And so again, the atmosphere and the oceans work together. But the Coriolis effect also generates other types of stronger winds in the upper layer of the troposphere, and it's the Earth's jet streams. They have huge impacts of regional weathers, and we have the polar jet streams and the subtropical jet streams as part of this effect, the Coriolis effect. And again, as I said, they have huge impacts on regional weathers, because the weather changes when the position of the jet streams change, plus other factors, of course, such as atmospheric pressure, etc. But the jet streams, the position of them in the rotation of the Earth and everything have huge impacts on regional weathers, regional climates. Okay, so now we will put all this together. And this redistribution of heat, because of the difference between equator and the polar regions, plus the surface winds generated in the atmosphere, result in the global ocean circulation, or what is known the conveyor belt. and it's a key regulator of climate by storing and transporting heat, carbon, nutrients, and fresh water across the planet. Again, it's atmosphere and oceans working together to make our planet sustainable. So the ocean is connected by this global circulation, also due to other factors such as salinity, seawater density, oxygen, and nutrients. But the important thing here, just please notice the red band there, which it's representing transportation of heat, warm surface flow, and then the cool subsurface flow. I will explain a little bit more about this, because this global circulation is actually vital for the survival and of the whole planet, and this interaction. As a matter of, the mathematical models, this is a very slow movement of water, particularly the subsurface flow. And it has been estimated that it takes around 1,000 years for this ocean circulation to complete a cycle. So it's very slow, but very efficient. Once again, in this picture, I would like you to notice the cryosphere, the frozen regions, and the proportions of those frozen regions, particularly the polar regions, with the frozen ocean in the area, the permafrost, which is ice that never thaws, the ice caps on Greenland and Antarctica, because they have huge capacity to reflect radiation from the sun. Without them, the planet would most probably overheat. And the polar regions, the cryosphere, part of the cryosphere, they reflect heat in the form of radiation because of what is called albedo, the capacity to reflect heat in the form of radiation. Sea ice, for example, has an albedo of 40%. Fresh snow has 80 and 90% albedo, reflects more. The reason is because ice is darker than fresh snow. Fresh snow is whiter, it's got higher albedo. Ocean surface, on the other hand, has an albedo of 3%, so very low albedo. And therefore, the ocean has an immense capacity to absorb radiation from the sun. So that's interesting. On the one hand, the ice caps, the polar regions, they have huge capacity to reflect back solar radiation, and the ocean has the surface oceans have huge capacity to absorb radiation. All that to make the efficiency of redistribution of heat on the one hand, but also to help us to keep our atmosphere, our biosphere habitable. But the oceans, as we know, as a byproduct of global warming, are also warming up with consequences for the planet. There are some evidence that this ocean circulation is slowing down and with a bit unknown consequences. But I will try to make a note about a side note on this. And I would like to point out that when we talk about in climate change and the rising sea levels is not the result of melting sea ice, but the result of melting of the ice caps in the Arctic region, which is particularly alarming, and the melting of glaciers and permafrost. And in the Antarctic, the evidence also shows that there are melting glaciers there too. So it's melting ice from land that is causing sea levels to rise. It's not the ice melting in the oceans, the Southern Ocean, for example, or the Arctic Ocean, but it's melting on land, particularly glaciers in certain parts of the cryosphere. I would like to give an example of this. An example of this global ocean circulation and how it works for us, particularly in the northern Atlantic region, the North Atlantic area, and and we pay special attention to the North Atlantic ocean circulation and the Gulf Stream. The reason is the Gulf Stream is part of the North Atlantic Gyre, which is a circular ocean surface current as a result of the surface winds and the Coriolis effect. Now, the ocean transports heat through masses of water, warm water in this case, surface waters in this case. And this water will travel, masses of water will travel from the warmer water of the lovely Caribbean areas and the tropic areas, and is going to travel north to the North Atlantic. And what the result of this, it's when it starts reaching the North Atlantic and particularly Western Europe and Iceland, it's the masses of water which is traveling with its heat releases the heat back into the atmosphere, and the result of that, helped by the jet streams, by the way, the result is that Western Europe, for example, has a milder climate, milder types of weather compared to similar latitudes in Canada and other parts of North America. Once again, we see the relationship between atmosphere and the oceans working together to redistribute heat, influencing our climate, influencing our regional weathers, and making a difference. So this is an example. But then what happens in other layers of the deep ocean? And this is basically what happens in what is called the Atlantic Ocean thermohaline circulation. Which is the red band there. It's the Gulf Stream influencing the North Atlantic, and then the North Atlantic sending south of the Atlantic cooler waters. I'm going to explain a little bit more. So the red bands is warm, fresh, less dense, shallow water, and when it reaches the North Atlantic, which is cold, salty, dense, and deep water, pushes southwards, pushes down to the deep, the other waters, and southwards, and starts traveling, and it starts creating this ocean circulation in the Atlantic. And this is what happens, shall we say, a transversal picture of what's happening with the waters. The Atlantic thermohaline circulation, and there we have the surface water coming from the Caribbean areas, reaching the north, and the north, which is denser waters, pushing down those waters and started traveling to the south towards the Southern Ocean, towards the Antarctic. On the other hand, what happens on the other hand is the Antarctic, the Southern Ocean, which is also cold, salty, and dense water, also sends flows of colder and denser waters northwards beneath the North Atlantic deep water. So this is very slow movement of water, and the southern water, also the southern Atlantic water, also reaches the North Atlantic region. So there is again transfer of heat and movement and energy ultimately from north to south and south to north. It's always in motion, very slow movements and that is also what generates this global conveyor belt, which it goes all across the global oceans. So the ice, let's go back to, I'm going to go back a little bit to this one here, this picture, because the ice in the Antarctic region and the ocean, and the Antarctic region and the Southern Ocean is essential for this circulation to happen, the difference in heat and nutrients and salinity. The sea ice and ice caps in Greenland and Antarctica as part of the cryosphere are very important for climate change science. Let me just go And the reason is this. Climate change science, just let me pause here a little bit and show this beautiful picture, well, diagram of Antarctica. What we've got on the right, that picture there of those scientists there, what they are doing, they are drilling very deep levels of what is called the ice core of the Antarctic shelf, or the Antarctic core, or yes, cap as well. And what they are doing, the reason is because there are layers of ice on the Antarctic and also in Greenland. And in a very well-known region that has been explored is what is called Dome C. You've got it there at the bottom of that diagram of Antarctica, Dome C. And they get samples of these ice cores, and these ice cores are truly time machines. These ice sheets have been forming for thousands of years, and the samples of the ice core reveal layers. Some layers are thinner, some are thicker, and they look like this. Here on the top bit, you've got a sample of one of those ice cores, and you will see that it's showing layers there. Now, through them, we know the past atmospheres of the Earth. And on the bottom right of your screen there is a transversal cut of a piece of this ice core. And the reason we know the past atmosphere is because of the bubbles trapped in the ice cores, because they are samples of those past atmosphere. This is direct data from greenhouse gases going back 800,000 years. The older samples that we have are found in Antarctica ice core. But this is very interesting because it is possible to create, shall we say, a nice timeline of what has been happening in past atmospheres. And from them, we know that there have been around 9 ice ages throughout all these 800,000 years or more. And that is what is called direct data. So we have direct data trapped in these ice cores, which are very helpful for climate science. But there is correlation. The water also contained in those ice cores, they give us what is called proxy data. When analyzed in the oxygen measurements have given what is called proxy data, and has been possible to deduce the temperature of the atmosphere during those past ages. There's a lot of details there, but it's beyond the scope of this talk. But that is one of the data used to create in the end the mathematical models for climate change, climate science. So these ice caps in the polar regions are very important for the sustainability of the planet. Now I move to another type of interaction between atmosphere and the oceans. And I'm going to skip this one because we already talked about it. And this is just an image portraying the differences of heat between the equator. It's a satellite thermal image that it's a way that science today has to measure up what's happening with these differences of heat. Obviously, cooler waters are portrayed blue and purple in that picture. But this is another important thing here for the interaction, and it's photosynthesis. And the reason is this, because when the atmosphere and the oceans get in contact, carbon emissions in the atmosphere has a huge capacity to dissolve into the waters, into the oceans, dissolves very quickly. Now, what happens with that CO2 emissions, with those two carbon gases, it's that in the water, in the oceans, it's transformed through photosynthesis into organic matter and oxygen. The same photosynthesis that happens in the forests, in the Amazon, and all the trees that we've got on land, happens the same chemical process in the oceans. And other key interactions between atmosphere. So it's capturing, the oceans also not only capture heat from the atmosphere, they also capture huge amounts of CO2 emissions. And that's why, I will explain a bit more about this, we call them carbon sink. And the key molecule here, of course, is chlorophyll. It's a beautiful molecule, because that molecule in the end has the capacity to transform energy from inorganic matter, CO2, water, and heat, into another type of energy, which is organic matter. Organic matter, it's needed because at the end of the day is food for all the plants, I mean, all the animal and you know, kingdom and everything, and for us as well. So it's transformation of energy from inorganic matter through this molecule chlorophyll into organic matter. And also the oceans give us oxygen. Nearly half of the oxygen of the planet comes from the oceans through photosynthesis. Now the question is, how does this happen? We know that on land it happens on trees and leaves and everything it happens there. In the case of the oceans, one example happens in what is called in coastal areas, is what is called the kelp forests. And here in Britain, for example, and in many coastal regions, we have kelp forests, and they are very rapid growth. And the beauty of them is that they are truly underwater forests. They attract huge amounts of biodiversity, and all when they are present, a lot of marine life and marine animals, they thrive among these kelp forests. And look at the colors. Some of them, they are green, some others are more sort of brownish, but they are producing photosynthesis. They are capturing CO2 emissions in coastal waters and giving us back, transforming energy into organic type of energy, organic matter, and giving us oxygen, oxygenating of obviously the water that is needed for marine life, but also ultimately giving us nearly half of the oxygen that it's needed in the planet. So that happens underwater, but there is more. But the big, really, the big producers of photosynthesis in the oceans is this tiny little creatures, plankton. There are various types, zooplankton, phytoplankton, and bacterioplankton, but we focus the attention in phytoplankton and bacterioplankton. They're basically algae, unicell algae. That is a picture of different type of plankton, but we will focus our attention in what is called phytoplankton. And this is called in marine primary production of organic matter and energy. This is the first level of food production or in the oceans, and is going to feed the rest of the trophic levels in the marine life. And we focus on phytoplankton, particularly common and you know, in the billions of them. Diatoms and dinoflagellates are very, very important. And look at the color of these are microorganisms, micro unicells. They're green. The reason is because they've got chlorophyll, and that molecule changes everything, because all these tiny little creatures everywhere in the global oceans, they're capturing CO2 emissions through chlorophyll and giving us back organic matter and oxygen. They are purifying our oceans. They are purifying our atmosphere. So they're absolutely vital. These tiny little creatures, absolutely vital for our survival of the planet. Also, on the black and white there, you've got an important group one. They're called the coccolithophores. Coccolithophores, and the reason is because they've got this cover of carbonate calcium, and they also capture um, ca carbon emissions, and they form these literally like shells in a way, the limescale shells, you know, and they're capturing CO2 emissions, and they use it as part of their armor, if you like it, you know. And also those are also producing, you know, they are photosynthetic little creatures, you know, microalgae. And also another type is bacterioplankton, a particular type, which is cyanobacteria, very, very important, very basic and ancient type forms of life, but particularly important in the oceans. So all these tiny little creatures are doing fantastic things for us, producing oxygen, capturing CO2 emissions, and giving us also organic matter. Ultimately, it's going to be food for all the trophic layers, you know, in marine life, and let's say, and for humans as well, for the human species. I hope that gives a basic picture of what plankton does for us, but it's very, very important. So here we come now to what is called or known as the biological carbon pump, as the ocean as a carbon sink. And it's exactly the process that I have explained, which is atmospheric CO2 is dissolved into the oceans, captured by phytoplankton, all the types that I have already mentioned, and they transform that into organic matter. And when they die because they're short-lived, then that carbon that has been part of also, you know, it sinks down into the bottom of the oceans, and and therefore that's why the carbon storage is by sedimentation. So it eventually it's going to be deposited down the bottom of the oceans, all that CO2 that has been used by these beautiful creatures called plankton, phytoplankton particularly. So that is part of what is called the biological carbon pump in the oceans, and vitally important. When again we consider the 3/4 of the planet is it's ocean, so this is happening at large scales. By the way, one thing that we also need to take into account, just because we are facing this COVID-19, as a matter of fact, viruses in the oceans are very, very widespread. There are countless amounts of viruses. So I just throw that into this mix of ocean, you know, creatures there. But anyway, let's move on. And this is another picture, just as an example image of plankton activity in the oceans, in the global oceans. And in this particular case, the more active regions are the orange and yellow areas, patches there, cooler waters. But by the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but cooler waters have more capacity to absorb CO2 emissions. So that's an important thing, because when we think about global warming, warming of the oceans makes the oceans less efficient to capture CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. So again, this is just a picture. Those patches there in the middle of the Pacific Oceans, the Indian Ocean, and the Arctic Ocean, that purple patches, they're usually called ocean deserts, because they're less active, there's less life, less nutrients available, and therefore there's less activity. and less of these processes happen in those sort of regions. But this is just as an example of an image of the global plankton activity. Very, very important and crucial, again, for the sustainability of the planet. Again, atmosphere and oceans interacting, redistributing heat, energy, and also capturing CO2 emissions and giving us back oxygen for the biosphere. The physical carbon pump, this is a quote from the IPCC. Sorry, we move now to the physical carbon pump, and its CO2 dissolution process is dependent on water temperature. As the water gets cooler, low temperature, more CO2 dissolves, hence the importance of polar regions in the carbon cycle. That's a quote from the IPCC report. So ocean warming, in other words, and ocean acidification is a threat to the physical, particularly the physical and the biological carbon pumps. But a warmer ocean will make the physical carbon pump, the dissolution process of CO2 from the atmosphere into the oceans, less efficient. And that will create ocean acidification. Let me see if I think I've got a few more minutes to explain a bit more about this. But we're getting now towards the end of this talk. And the physical carbon pump, it's purely and simple the ocean as a carbon sink into the deep cold waters, and results from the ocean circulation, from winds from the atmosphere and the other movements of water, slow movements of water. And this plays a major role in climate change mitigation. Again, it's dissolved CO2, which is not captured by phytoplankton and all these microscopic creatures. It's by movements of water in the oceans. In the end, it's the sequestration of the carbon into the deep cold waters. It's not used by the plankton, but it's still is the sequestration of these molecules of dissolved carbon dioxide happens, and it's like dragged down, if you want, to the deep cold waters. And that's why the oceans is also has it's known to have this physical carbon pump. I think I've got a little bit just what happens with global warming, climate change, if you want. It's ocean acidification. With this slide, it's only to mention what happens with this process of acidification of the ocean. The oceans are the waters in the oceans are naturally less acidic, shall we put it that way, less acidic. And so the more, it's an equation, so the more we put CO2 we put into the oceans, and the less effective the oceans become because of the warmer global warming, the less that efficient would the ocean be able to cope with these concentrations of CO2. In the oceans, what happens in the end, it's that when it's dissolved and in contact with water, the molecule, it's produced carbonic acid. That carbonic acid molecule, it's unstable and it's dissolved into bicarbonate ions, and that is then dissociated into hydrogen ions and carbonate ions. And the trouble is, the more we move this equation to the right, the more concentrations of hydrogen ions we will have in the oceans, and that is what going to cause the acidification, because what is measured up is pH, the concentration of hydrogen ions, and the more concentrations is the lower the pH, and there's more acidification, and that will cause lots of problems for marine life, and of course the ocean will become less efficient in capturing CO2 emissions, as well as will increase the melting of ice caps in the polar regions. So unfortunately, if that happens, it will also start increasing the melting of the ice caps, and all our climate will, you know, will be affected by all this process. I think, Ben, I'm not sure. I've come to the end of this talk, of this process. I mean, this is just an example with a coral reef affected by ocean acidification, and we all know the beauty of coral reefs. And the reason, briefly to explain, is because the coral reef, the corals are basically animals, and they've got these little microalgae that they help them. They're helped by the microalgae to absorb radiation and produce photosynthesis, and that's that produce their energy. When in warmer waters, the coral reefs cannot retain those microalgae as part of their bodies, part of the and therefore they're affected by ocean acidification, and effectively they die. So it's more complex, but I don't have time to explain everything. All right, I think we've come to the end of this talk. Thank you for attending this meeting. Thank you for listening. And I'm not sure if Bengt is the host.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right.
Yep, thank you.